You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
As 1863 began, the Union Army of the Potomac found itself in a general malaise. Its failed attempt at another push towards Richmond, known as the Mud March, had served as the nail in the coffin of Army Commander Ambrose E Burnside. When Joseph Hooker took his place as commander of the Army of the Potomac, the changes he implemented helped boost the morale and the confidence of his troops. But Hooker squandered that goodwill by bungling the Chancellorsville Campaign in the early days of May 1863. While some believe that drunkenness or the artillery round that knocked him out for a short time were the probable causes of such bungling, Hooker himself told Major General Abner Doubleday while on the road to Gettysburg, "I was not hurt by a shell, and I was not drunk. For once, I lost confidence in Hooker, and that is all there was to it." After Chancellorsville, while Hooker was looking for ways to redeem himself, Robert E. Lee was setting the wheels in motion for his second invasion of the North. By mid-June, two great armies totaling somewhere around 150,000 men, with tens of thousands of horses and mules, miles of wagons, and in one of those armies, human beings that were owned by other human beings, marched into Pennsylvania. Meanwhile, everyday citizens in a bustling country town called Gettysburg were going about their daily business while reading about the war in any or all of the town's 3 newspapers. War had not left them untouched, however. Constant threats of invasion plagued them since they first sent their local militia, the Gettysburg Blues, to fight to preserve the Union in 1861. By the 4th of July of 1863, this small town of 2,400 would be left with the daunting task of cleaning up the carnage and healing many times its number in wounded soldiers who wore both blue and gray. On the last day of June, the lead elements of these two armies would be poised for the commencement of the greatest, bloodiest battle ever fought in the Western Hemisphere. But very few had any notion of that as they closed their eyes to sleep that night. Lee reorganizes.
April 8, 1863. I am inclined to think that will be the move we make. March for Maryland, turning the Yankee Army, and force them to fall back upon Washington. I am now in favor of going straight through Maryland into Pennsylvania, and I believe we can do it. General Lee undoubtedly has some bold plan upon foot. Brigadier General Dorsey Pender.
As unlikely and great as Lee's victory at Chancellorsville was, the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia knew all too well that his victory had done hardly more than postpone the inevitable. Lee knew that the Army of the Potomac outnumbered and outsupplied his own. Just as it was 9 months earlier, Lee faced a dilemma between one of two things: either to retire to Richmond and stand a siege which must ultimately have ended in surrender, or to invade Pennsylvania. Victory on Northern soil might urge the peace Democrats in the North to push to bring the war to a close with reasonable terms for a free and independent Confederacy. Perhaps even, Britain and France would intervene on the Confederacy's behalf. But as always, supplies were Lee's immediate concern. Southern railroads were too inefficient and inadequate to keep Lee supplied. Moreover, the region the railroads operated in was crawling with enemy troops. Thus, Lee was not able to keep his men properly clothed or fed. For Lee's cavalry, the matter of horseshoes and the nails and forges required to shape and apply them was also a difficult one.
It was not an uncommon occurrence to see a cavalryman leading his limping horse along the road, while from his saddle dangled the hoofs of a dead horse, which he had cut off for the sake of the sound shoes nailed to them. Henry B. McClellan, adjutant to General Stuart.
Major General Henry Harry Heath recalled that Lee once told him, The question of food for this army gives me more trouble and uneasiness than anything else. Lush and untouched, Pennsylvania would be able to feed his men and horses for months. Lee had to invade again. In Richmond, Lee lobbied for 3 days for Confederate officials to support his plan. Postmaster General John Reagan from Texas cared more about the Confederate war effort and its armies in the West, and insisted that Lee divert some of his troops to aid the besieged city of Vicksburg, Mississippi. President Jefferson Davis, whose home was in Mississippi, could be described as uneasy about Lee's idea. The situation for the Southern cause was not as good as the Army of Northern Virginia's victories made it seem. Stonewall Jackson was dead. The war in the East was at an impasse, and in the Western theater, Union General Ulysses S. Grant had Vicksburg in a vice. A bold move was now required in order to break the stalemate in the East or the siege in the West, and Robert E. Lee was just the man to do it. Lee's almost godlike stature in the South helped him win over his doubters, causing them to approve his plan by a vote of 5-1. The Army of Northern Virginia would once again invade the North. Lee's first order of business after his return from Richmond was to reorganize his army. Since taking command in June of 1862, Lee had felt the two-corps system currently in use was cumbersome and ineffective. Each corps contained somewhere around 30,000 men, proving too difficult for one corps commander to handle, especially in the wooded areas of Virginia. On May 30th, Lee announced his changes. Retaining his position at the helm of the 1st Corps, consisting of the divisions of Lafayette McLaws, George E. Pickett, and John Bell Hood, was James Longstreet, Lee's old war horse, who Lee looked at as his trusted advisor. Longstreet was also the second in command of the Army of Northern Virginia. Moving up to take Jackson's place at the head of the 2nd Corps with a promotion to lieutenant general was Richard Stoddard Ewell, one of Jackson's division commanders who often complained about Jackson's tendency to leave his subordinates in the dark about his plans. Under Ewell's command were the divisions of Jubal A. Early, Edward Johnson, and Robert E. Rhodes. The new 3rd Corps, commanded by Ambrose Powell A.P. Hill, the hero of Sharpsburg, was comprised of the divisions of R.H. Anderson, formerly of Longstreet's Corps, Henry Heath, placed in command of a newly formed division, and William Dorsey Pender, Hill's preferred choice to take command of his old division. Lee described Hill as the best soldier of his grade with me. Major General James Ewell Brown Jeb Stuart retained command of his cavalry division, which was expanded from 3 to 6 brigades. One of these brigade commanders was Brigadier General William Grumble Jones, who earned his nickname for his curmudgeonly ways. While Stuart was flamboyant and gregarious, Jones was disheveled in appearance, sporting blue jeans and a homemade jacket. There was a bitterness between Stuart and Jones that would soon play out during the Gettysburg Campaign. Robert E. Lee's son, William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, affectionately called Rooney, also commanded a brigade under Stuart, as did his cousin, Fitzhugh Lee. Unlike the Union Army, in which the reserve artillery was under the command of one general attached to Army headquarters, the reserve artillery in the Army of Northern Virginia was attached directly to each corps in battalions for the Gettysburg Campaign. Each infantry corps had roughly 20,000 men, and when combined with the cavalry and artillery, Lee marched north with roughly 75,000 Confederates, who referred to themselves rather tongue-in-cheek as Lee's Miserables, a reference to Victor Hugo's 1862 novel, Les Miserables. While Lee's army may have looked miserable, the boys in blue across the Rappahannock actually were miserable. I must tell you, Lincoln wrote Army of the Potomac Commander Joseph Hooker, that I have some painful intimations that some of your corps and division commanders are not giving you their entire confidence. This would be ruinous, if true. Going into the Chancellorsville Campaign, Joe Hooker was overly confident, bombastic, and perhaps delusional. Lee's victory over Hooker's larger army would have humbled most other generals, but not Fighting Joe Hooker. Instead, Hooker regained his cocky delusions and began to plan for another attack on Lee. No general battle was fought at Chancellorsville, Hooker wrote to Lincoln. I was unwilling to give battle with such great odds against me. We lost no honor at Chancellorsville. He called the battle a reverse that he blamed on a cause which could not be foreseen and not provided against. Had Chancellorsville been a victory for Hooker, he may have enjoyed the enthusiastic confidence from his officers and men and his bosses in Washington, but Chancellorsville was a defeat, and an embarrassing one at that. Lincoln, on May 14th, advised Hooker to mark time and keep Lee at bay, rather than attempt another crossing of the Rappahannock and the battle or battles that were sure to follow. He did make sure to let Hooker know, however, that this was advice and not an order. Lincoln also advised Hooker to take the time to get his army back into shape. Perhaps to relieve himself from the responsibility of future failure, Hooker accepted the advice. The high command of the Army of the Potomac had lost faith in Hooker's abilities as an army commander. John Sedgwick and Henry Slocum, two corps commanders, had been secretly plotting to have Hooker replaced. But Lincoln was hardly ready to find another army commander yet, saying, I am not disposed to throw away a gun because it misfired once. Later in May, Hooker caught wind of a private meeting between Generals Reynolds and Meade and Pennsylvania Governor Andrew Curtin, in which the two generals expressed their displeasure and lack of faith in Hooker. Curtin, ever the alarmist, quickly took flight to the White House to warn Lincoln of this dissension. On May 15th, Hooker summoned Meade to his headquarters for an explanation. Meade explained that his comments were made in confidence and that Governor Curtin had no right to repeat them. But he added that everything he had said to Curtin he had already said to Hooker directly during the course of the battle. As the conversation continued, tempers began to rise in both Meade and Hooker. Fifth Corps Staff Officer Alexander Webb recalled that Meade's famous temper had eventually boiled over and that he damned Hooker very freely. Once it got to that point, Webb left the tent in haste in order to avoid becoming a witness for a court-martial. Hooker and Meade soon cooled down, but the damage was done between them. I am sorry to tell you, Meade wrote his wife, that I am in open war with Hooker. Likely, Joseph Hooker had to deal with changes of personnel in the high command, though not as many. Darius Couch, Major General in command of the Second Corps, had been so disgusted with Hooker's mismanagement of the Chancellorsville Campaign that he requested reassignment and was subsequently transferred to command the newly formed Department of the Susquehanna headquartered in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Replacing him at the head of the Second Corps was Division Commander Winfield Scott Hancock. After the Battle of Chancellorsville, the self-promoting Cavalry Division Commander Alfred Pleasanton replaced Cavalry Corps Commander Major General George Stoneman. Stoneman was relieved and sent back to Washington to receive medical treatment for chronic hemorrhoids exacerbated by cavalry service. Once relegated to a mere administrative role, Chief of Artillery Brigadier General Henry Hunt was put back in command of the Artillery Reserve of the Army of the Potomac. Proving to be an important and valuable change was the creation of the Bureau of Military Information, or BMI, back when Hooker took command during the winter. Until the BMI was created, the Army of the Potomac received its intelligence from the famous Pinkerton Agency. The Pinkertons, as good as they may have been as detectives in civilian matters, were not military intelligence gatherers, nor military analysts. Too often, they overestimated the strength of their Confederate foes, paralyzing commanders like George McClellan. Unlike Pinkerton, Colonel George Sharp would utilize military men. His agents would gather information from prisoners of war, refugees, Southern newspapers, documents recovered from battlefields, and they would figure out where the enemy's army was when on the march based on disruption of telegraph communications. As a result, more accurate information came in. During the Gettysburg Campaign, the BMI would prove to be invaluable to the Army of the Potomac. But it was the infantry that weighed heavily on Hooker's mind the most. Thousands of enlistments were about to expire, and while Lee's 3 corps grew in their respective numbers, Hooker's were shrinking. While Hooker's foot soldiers had better uniforms, wore better footwear, and were better fed than Lee's, they did not possess a great advantage in arms and ammunition, as it is traditionally believed. Several regiments fired smoothbore muskets that used buck and ball as the projectile. Buck and ball consisted of 3 small lead balls and 1 larger one. But what plagued the Army of the Potomac most was a lack of confidence. Not necessarily in itself, but rather of the red-headed, blue-eyed egotist at the head of the army. Most of the Army's problems, however, were more the fault of Washington than the Army's itself. While the number of soldiers was on the wane, most who remained were veterans, with much experience marching long, hard miles and even harder fighting. While Southern newspapers derided Union troops by calling them hirelings, foreign mercenaries, and scum of the cities, the opposite was true. Most were born in America, and they volunteered for service. While their motives for doing so varied from love of adventure, financial security, or patriotism, there wasn't much of a difference between Billy Yank and Johnny Reb. On May 27th, Hooker received word from his chief of intelligence that Lee's army was under marching orders and would most likely move forward upon or above our right flank. Then on the 4th of June, Hooker's hot air balloons observed that some Confederate camps in the area of Fredericksburg had been abandoned. Hooker wanted to cross the Rappahannock and pitch into those Confederate troops remaining. Lincoln was quick to squash this notion within an hour of receiving word from Hooker. To attack the Confederate forces remaining at Fredericksburg while another force maneuvered to Hooker's right might have caused the Army of the Potomac to become entangled upon the river like an ox jumped half over a fence and liable to be torn by dogs front and rear, without a fair chance to gore one way or kick the other. Hooker felt confused and stymied. He turned to his intelligence officer for more information. He would soon learn that Confederate cavalry was massed in the area of Culpeper, Virginia. Now was his chance to find out what was going on. Stuart was in all his glory. Jeb Stuart's Confederate cavalrymen were arrayed in double-line formation on the plain just west of the Rappahannock, near Culpeper, Virginia. Mounted and at attention, Stuart's men waited in silence. Flags fluttered in the late spring breeze. Horses snorted and stomped their hooves as they stood in line, anxious for whatever their riders were about to compel them to do. Stuart gave them one proud, final look before giving them the signal. At the start of the war, the cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia originated as separate regiments or smaller units, like Jeb Stuart's 1st Virginia Cavalry or Hampton's Legion, which were attached to larger units or districts. But by September of 1861, with ringing endorsements from Generals Pierre-Gustave Toutant Beauregard, Joseph E. Johnston, and James Longstreet, Jeb Stuart found himself promoted to Brigadier General and given command of the cavalry of the Army of Northern Virginia, which at that time was a single brigade. By the time of the Antietam Campaign, Stuart had received a promotion to Major General, and his cavalry had ballooned to a division of 4 brigades, and then to 6 by Gettysburg. The Confederate cavalry did not have an easy time being supplied and outfitted for life in the field. At the start of the war, cavalrymen furnished their own horses, saddles, and tack. English round-tree saddles were quite common and did more harm to the backs of the horses than anything else. Eventually, they were replaced with a government-issued saddle designed for the horse's comfort, but not the troopers. The troopers were armed with a hodgepodge of pistols, sabers, rifles, and carbines. The wealthier counties of Virginia were able to arm their companies with revolvers, but others could not. Breech-loading carbines, short rifles that load from the rear rather than the muzzle, were scarce, and most regiments couldn't scrounge more than 1 or 2 squadrons worth of them anyway. Beverly Robertson's 2 regiments from North Carolina, which joined Stuart's division in May of 1863, carried sabers and Enfield rifles. While a rifle had longer range than a carbine, it was an impractical arm for the mounted service. When a cavalryman's horse was killed or disabled, he would be sent home to procure another for himself. It usually took 30 to 60 days for this process to play out, but often it would take much longer if good horse flesh was scarce, or, in the case of such units from states like the Carolinas or Georgia, distance added to the time. This highly inefficient system sometimes found Stuart's cavalry so plagued with absenteeism that its numbers had been cut in half.
There are 3 brigades of cavalry 3 miles from Culpeper County Courthouse, toward Kelly's Ford. These are Fitzlee's, William H. Fitzhugh Lee's, and Wade Hampton's brigades. The Confederate Army is under marching orders, and an order from General Lee was very lately read to the troops, announcing a campaign of long marches and hard fighting. Colonel George Sharp, Chief of Intelligence, Army of the Potomac.
George Sharp's report to General Hooker was correct. His Bureau of Military Information had noticed that on May 22nd, Stuart reviewed the 3 brigades he had under his command at the time, totaling about 4,000 men. Shortly thereafter, Grumble Jones's and Beverly Robertson's brigades joined Stuart, and so, on June 5th, Stuart called for another review, with the expectation that his commander, Robert E. Lee, would be present. To Stuart's disappointment, Lee could not attend, but the pageantry went on nonetheless, with the cavalry being put through its paces in a mock charge at the horse artillery lined up and firing blanks from a ridge, all to the delight of the civilian spectators in attendance. On June 7th, Stuart received word that Lee wished to review the cavalry on the following day. So, on June 8th, Stuart, resplendent in his new uniform, complete with a cape and a black ostrich plume in his hat, gave the signal to his waiting troopers on the plain. Bugles rang out their calls to advance. 22 regiments of cavalry maneuvered into columns of 4s, their horses kicking up a huge cloud of dust as they proudly marched by their beloved Army commander, Robert E. Lee. Lee wouldn't allow the pomp and circumstance of the review of June 5th. No galloping, no wasting of powder. Stuart's men and horses needed to be well rested, and his supplies of powder needed to be conserved for the march north that was already underway. Men of Major General John Bell Hood's infantry division of Longstreet's 1st Corps also stood by and watched the review. Hood was a former cavalryman and decided his men might get a kick out of watching the pageantry of that branch of the service, which they typically treated with disdain and scorn. Hoots and hollers, jeers and catcalls filled the air as the cavalry passed. When the raw recruits fell out of step or a trooper's hat flew off his head, the din of derision would swell to a crescendo. Even Stuart wasn't immune from the ridicule of Hood's veterans. Then Lee appeared, joining Stuart at the head of the column, and the jeers turned to genuine cheers for Marse Robert. Out of courtesy to Lee, the cheering was extended to Jeb Stuart. Lee later wrote to his wife that it was a splendid sight. The men and horses looked well. They recuperated since last fall. Stuart was in all his glory. Grumble Jones, no fan of Stuart's, remarked, "No doubt the Yankees have witnessed from their signal stations this show in which Stuart has exposed to view his strength and aroused their curiosity. They will want to know what is going on, and if I'm not mistaken, we'll be over early in the morning to investigate." After the review, Stuart conferred with Lee while his brigades went into bivouac roughly 8 miles from Culpeper near Brandy Station. The next morning, they were to cross to the Yankee side of the Rappahannock River in a move to protect the Army's flank as it disappeared into the cover of the Shenandoah Valley. So far as Lee knew, Hooker was not yet wise to his movements. But just as Grumble Jones surmised, Hooker was at least aware that Lee's army was on the move, though he wasn't aware of Lee's intentions. Fearing that Stuart's cavalry was moving to strike his rear, Hooker sent Pleasanton's 3 Union cavalry divisions, supported by 2 infantry brigades, on a spoiling raid, with orders to disperse the Confederate cavalry.
Think outside the bus and let Getty's Bike Tours show you the only way to truly experience Gettysburg. There's a reason why Getty's Bike Tours is the longest running bicycle tour company in Gettysburg, and that's because they put the customer's experience at the top of their list of priorities. Follow a licensed battlefield guide through some of the most legendary ground in American history. There's a tour route for everyone, from the newbie to the hardcore history buff. So go to gettysbike.com or call 717-752-7752 and book your reservation today. Mention address in Gettysburg and receive 10% off your tour. That's gettysbike.com or 717-752-7752. Discount does not apply to rentals.
Oh, my favorite place to go. Mason-Dixon Distillery. They create their award-winning spirits from grain grown on Gettysburg National Military Park. And they cook their comfort food from ingredients sourced from local farms. For great food, amazing drinks, engaging conversation, and plenty of on-site parking, which is really hard to find here in Gettysburg, head over to Mason-Dixon Distillery, located at 331 East Water Street. Mention you heard this ad on Addressing Gettysburg and get a free dessert with any meal. That's right, I said free, just because you mentioned this show. That's Mason-Dixon Distillery, 331 East Water Street, Gettysburg, Pennsylvania.
What's up, guys? My name's John. I am the Tattooed Historian. And if you want friction-free history, edgy, new, exciting, you're going to want to check out my podcast, The Tattooed Historian Show, on iTunes or Spotify.
Victorian Photography Studio, located on Steinwar Avenue in historic downtown Gettysburg, is a vintage tintype and digital portrait studio. With hundreds of dresses and uniforms, as well as period-correct props and backgrounds, VPS can help you capture the perfect moment in time. As one of the few remaining practitioners of the craft, the photographers at VPS are trained in the history and artistry of wet plate collodion photography. So stop on in or book online for a truly unique Gettysburg experience. Go to VictorianPhotographyStudio.com and follow them on Facebook and Instagram at VPS_Gettysburg. That's VictorianPhotographyStudio.com and at VPS_Gettysburg on social media.
Hey, this is Avery Lentz of Battles and Banter Podcast. You can find us on iTunes, Spotify, and other listening platforms. Give us a follow on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter at Battles and Banter. If you like funny banter and good history, this is the podcast for you.
Life lessons from American history. Here's one you can use today for personal growth.
Gettysburg Lessons, with one of 3 valuable lessons from Charles Knapp. Do what you ought to do. Life is a creative tension between what's in it for me and what you ought to do, between what you know and what you ought to know, between what you think and what you ought to think, between what you accept and what you ought to fight for. Freedom beckons you to do what you want to do, but responsibility tells you what you ought to do. Success is the union of the freedom to exercise your talents and the responsibility to use those talents wisely. Doing what you ought to do is the ideal influence. It is leadership in motion.
To get the full classroom course of Gettysburg Lessons, go to gettysburglessons.com/schools.
Dog tags in the Civil War, one of the most devastating Union defeats took place in Florida, Confederate Lancers in New Mexico, a camel as a regimental mascot. Learn this and more on the Untold Civil War podcast, available on iTunes, Spotify, and Buzzsprout website.
Are you a Civil War reenactor in need of a Corps badge, ID disc, or personal item to perfect your historical impression? Or are you a history buff who is in need of a small conversation piece? Shop with the badge maker at CivilWarCorpsBadges.com, where you will find unique insignias and more from the Civil War and 19th century. Display some handmade patriotism today and shop at CivilWarCorpsBadges.com. That's Corps spelled C-O-R-P-S. Okay, I know spots like these are annoying, but they're a necessary evil when it comes to free content, so here we go. There are 3 ways to support this show and the Addressing Gettysburg project as a whole. One, the most effective way, is becoming a monthly subscriber at patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. That's patreon.com/addressinggettysburg. Our patrons receive access to interviews with experts recorded especially for them. Number two, the fun way, by getting some merch over at our store at addressinggettysburg.com. Show that you are in the know by wearing one of our t-shirts, hoodies, or other items at addressinggettysburg.com. And number three, the free way. You shop at Amazon like everyone else, so why not make those unnecessary sales that only make you feel guilty anyway count for something? Every time you want to go and shop on Amazon, go to addressinggettysburg.com first, then click that Amazon banner at the top of the homepage, and sign in and shop like you normally would. The beauty of this is that Amazon gives us credit for qualifying sales while it doesn't cost you 1 cent more than you intended to spend in the first place. But you gotta make sure that you do it every time you shop Amazon. Okay, there. We're finished with the obligatory pitch for your support. Man, our Patreon patrons must be laughing right now saying, we don't have to sit through commercials on Patreon. Wink. The Battle of Brandy Station.
The only time in my 14-month service with General Stuart that he seemed rattled was when Frank Dean, one of his couriers, dashed up and told him that the Yankees were at Brandy Station. This was startling indeed. Frank Robertson, General Stuart's staff.
No fires were allowed in the Union cavalry camps on the night of June 8th. Troopers ate cold dinners, then slept on the ground with their horses' reins looped around an arm. All was quiet and calm, for just across the Rappahannock camped Jeb Stuart's Confederates. Pleasanton's combined force of 11,000 cavalry and infantry was poised for a double envelopment of Jeb Stuart and his 9,500 cavaliers. Just around 4:30 a.m., John Buford's Union division, led by the brigade of Colonel Benjamin Grimes Davis, crossed the Rappahannock River at Beverly's Ford in a thick fog and brushed aside Confederate pickets from the 6th Virginia Cavalry.
At about daylight, the Yanks drove in our pickets stationed at Beverly's Ford on the Rappahannock and came near surprising us in bed. They charged up to our camp and killed and wounded several horses before we could get out. Confederate artillerymen.
Behind the picket line were 4 batteries of Stuart's horse artillery parked in preparation for the day's march. Further behind them, about 2 miles from the ford at St. James Church, was the brigade of William Grumble Jones. Carbine and pistol shots crackled through the morning air, waking Jones. It took only a moment for him to come to his senses, and once aware of what was going on, Jones sent the 6th and 7th Virginia to meet the threat. In their haste to get at these Yankees, some troopers were barely dressed, and many rode their horses bareback. Major Cabell E. Flournoy of the 6th Virginia was able to rally about 100 men and charged with them into the Federals. But Flournoy was soon forced to withdraw in a hurry, as he and his men were badly outnumbered. Lieutenant R.O. Allen's horse was wounded, causing Allen to be left behind during Flournoy's withdrawal. Allen took cover in a tree line when he spotted a Union officer, Colonel Benjamin Grimes Davis, at the head of the column of Yankees. Down to only 1 bullet in his revolver, Allen decided it would be best spent taking out the brave blue-bellied officer daring to lead his men from the front. So Allen spurred his wounded horse towards Davis, whose back was turned. In the nick of time, Davis turned around and faced Allen for long enough to see that Allen was charging at him. Davis began swinging his saber in an effort to hit the charging rebel. Allen saved himself by dropping down to the horse's side and fired his revolver at Davis, sending his last bullet through the colonel's brain. Allen then galloped off to the safety of his own lines. The action of Grumble Jones's men enabled most of Stuart's artillery, which was camped dangerously close to Buford's troops, to fall back and form a line around St. James Church. Meanwhile, on Fleetwood Hill, Stewart was drinking his morning coffee at his headquarters. Fleetwood Hill, which ran north and south, was about a half a mile northeast of Brandy Station and around 4 miles behind the scene of Buford's Crossing. Stewart hastily sent his supply wagons towards Culpeper while his staff scurried this way and that to get themselves together to meet whatever danger was about to befall them. Stewart then ordered reinforcements ahead to the sound of the fighting. As Buford's brigades pushed their way further into the Confederate lines, Major Robert Morris, commander of the 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry, was ordered to clear the Confederates from his front. Morris and the 6th Pennsylvania, also known as Rush's Lancers, charged against the Confederate artillery.
We flew along, our men yelling like demons. Grape and canister were poured into our left flank and a storm of rifle bullets onto our front. We had to leap 3 wide, deep ditches, and many of our horses and men piled up in a writhing mass in those ditches and were ridden over. Captain Henry Wayland, 6th Pennsylvania Cavalry.
The 6th Pennsylvania's charge failed when Confederates counterattacked and drove them back after a brutal hand-to-hand melee. Major Morris was captured. One Confederate described the charge as brilliant and glorious. The 6th Pennsylvania suffered the highest casualty rate of any regiment at Brandy Station. This charge, however, seemed to stabilize the battle for the time being. Meanwhile, on the Confederate right, messengers from Beverly Robertson's brigade brought Grumble Jones some unwelcome news. A large dust cloud had been seen rising from the direction of Kelly's Ford in the Confederates' right rear. Jones rushed a courier to Stewart. Jeb Stewart was on the scene of the St. James Church line. The seriousness of the event still did not seem to occur to Stewart or his staff, as a few of his more youthful staff members climbed a nearby cherry tree. Jubilantly, they picked and threw cherries down to their comrades on the ground until a Federal shell careened through the tree. The shell sent splintered branches flying and the young staff officers plummeting to the relative safety of the ground. Stewart, beside himself with laughter, said, "What's the matter, boys? Cherries getting sour?" Around this time, one of Jones's couriers rode up to Stewart and delivered the message about the threat to his flank. The doubtful Stewart arrogantly replied, "Tell General Jones to attend to the Yankees in his front, and I'll watch the flanks." Upon receiving this reply, Jones grimly scoffed. "So he thinks they ain't coming, does he? Well, let him alone. He'll damn soon see for himself." The cloud of dust Jones warned Stewart about was being raised by the flanking force of General David McMurtry Gregg's and Alfred N. Dufay's divisions. Dufay's force split from Gregg's and proceeded further west in the direction of Stevensburg, roughly 5 miles from Brandy Station, in an effort to threaten the Confederate rear. Meanwhile, Gregg turned his column to the north, directly towards Brandy Station. Not a single rebel stood in Gregg's way, and Fleetwood Hill, which commanded his route, had no defense to speak of. Meanwhile, back at St. James Church, another courier rode up to Stewart, this time from that part of Stewart's own staff, which he left behind at Fleetwood Hill. In his haste to reach Beverly's Ford with 3 brigades to fight Buford's force, Stewart left Fleetwood Hill occupied only by his adjutant, Major Henry McClellan, and a smattering of couriers. McClellan, ever the good staff officer, went to see the threat to the right for himself.
And so it was. Within cannon shot of the hill, a long column of the enemy filled the road, which here skirted the woods. They were pressing steadily forward upon the railroad station, which would, in a few moments, be in their possession. Major Henry McClellan.
At the foot of Fleetwood Hill was a lone, undersupplied 6-pounder howitzer. Without batting an eye, McClellan ordered Lieutenant John W. Carter to deploy his gun to the heights and open fire with whatever ammunition he had left. McClellan promptly sent a courier to Stewart with a request for reinforcements, while he hoped that this solitary howitzer would slow or halt Gregg's Union cavalry long enough for help to arrive. Stewart, seemingly still in disbelief that what was happening was indeed happening, ordered a staff officer to go back to McClellan by saying, "Ride back there and see what all this foolishness is about." As this officer was leaving, another courier arrived and confirmed the news. "General," he shouted, "the Yankees are at Brandy." Stuart was now left with no doubt when he heard the sound of Lieutenant Carter's 6-pounder open fire. Now Stuart was quick to act. He sent 4 more artillery pieces and 2 of Grumble Jones's regiments to McClellan's aid. Meanwhile, McClellan found that his bluff had worked. Gregg's lead brigade under British soldier of fortune, Colonel Sir Percy Wyndham, deployed skirmishers and returned battery fire. Gregg ordered Wyndham's brigade to charge up Fleetwood Hill's western slope.
Not 50 yards below, Colonel Percy Wyndham was advancing the 1st New Jersey Cavalry in magnificent order, in columns of squadrons, with flags and guidons flying. Major Henry McClellan.
Simultaneously racing to the scene at full gallop from the opposite slope of the hill were Grumble Jones's regiments, the 6th and 7th Virginia Cavalry. Just as Carter's lone howitzer had exhausted its ammunition, Jones's men crowned the heights and plunged over the opposite slope into Wyndham's men with what one veteran called a dead heavy crash. Wyndham's cavalry split Jones's charging battalions like waves on the bow of a ship, according to the adjutant of the 1st New Jersey, Marcus Kitchen. Kitchen's commander, Lieutenant Colonel Virgil Broderick, galloped straight into a group of Confederates, running his saber through one of them, slashing the forehead of another, and shooting a third before he was swarmed by a dozen or so of the rebels and taken down. Kitchen himself was on the way to assist his chief when he too became the target of a gang of Confederate troopers.
The first one fired at me and missed. Before he could again cock his revolver, my saber took him in the neck. The blood gushed out in a black-looking stream. He gave a horrible yelp and fell over the side of his horse. Marcus Kitchen, 1st New Jersey Cavalry.
Kitchen spurred his horse at full gallop to a second Confederate, but his horse was shot out from under him, throwing Kitchen to the ground, leaving him half-conscious as the melee swirled around him. Before long, 2 Union brigades were entangled with 2 Confederate brigades. As the dust swirled around the mass of men and horses, so too did the sounds of mortal combat. The guttural gulps of men as they receive a saber blow or a pistol shot to the abdomen. The shrieks of frightened and wounded horses. The pop, pop, pop of revolvers sending their deadly projectiles toward a foe only a few feet away. And the clanging and scraping of sabers. Wyndham's brigade gained ground, overrunning the 4 pieces of artillery Stuart had sent to hold the hill. Then fresh rebel reinforcements arrived, scattering Wyndham's men. At the base of the hill, the 6th New York Battery had unlimbered 3 of its pieces. In no time, the 35th Virginia Battalion poured into the battery's position. One Federal trooper remembered, "One rebel on a splendid horse who sabered 3 gunners while I was chasing him. He wheeled in and out, would dart away, and then come sweeping back and cut down another man in a manner that seemed almost supernatural." Lieutenant Colonel E.V. White, the 35th's commander, recalled that the men of the battery fought with desperation. There was no demand for surrender or offer of one until nearly all the men were killed or wounded. Only 6 of the 36 men of the 6th New York Battery would come out unharmed. Meanwhile, to the northeast, Buford was trying again to dislodge the Confederates around St. James Church. The 6th Pennsylvania charged a second time, but the 9th Virginia checked their efforts and repulsed them. Then the 2nd U.S. Cavalry, a tough unit of regular Army troopers, smashed headlong into the fray.
There was little halting to make prisoners. Those who surrendered were told by emotion to go to the rear, and those who resisted were sabered or shot till they reeled from their saddles. Victor rushing on to engage a new foe. Captain Wesley Merritt, 2nd United States Cavalry.
At one point in the melee, Captain Merritt fought one-on-one with Brigadier General Rooney Lee. Merritt wounded the younger Lee with his saber. Rooney Lee would also be shot in the thigh before the battle was over, but not by Merritt. Days after Brandy Station, the Confederate hospital that Lee was convalescing in was captured by Union troops, and the son of the commander of the Army of Northern Virginia would become a prisoner of war as his father undertook an invasion of enemy territory. By the time the 10-hour battle was over, Stuart's cavalry held the field. Pleasanton's men withdrew, but not in defeat. Hooker's orders to him were to disperse and destroy Stuart's forces. Pleasanton, however, claimed that he was only ordered to make a reconnaissance in force. Either way, the Union cavalry had performed as aggressively and with as much determination as their Southern counterparts for the first time in the war. With a total of around 20,000 cavalry and infantry involved, the Battle of Brandy Station yielded a little over 1,400 casualties. Jeb Stuart needed to rest and refit his division, and Robert E. Lee was in no position to wait for him. The Army of Northern Virginia, led by Richard S. Ewell's 2nd Corps, crossed the Blue Ridge Mountains at Chester Gap in Virginia on June 10, 1863. Stuart had been surprised twice during the battle, the very thing that cavalry is supposed to guard against, and he was roundly criticized in the press. The Richmond Examiner went so far as to refer to Stuart's cavalry as puffed up, and the surprises were the consequences of negligence and bad management. Major General Lafayette McLaws, a division commander in Longstreet's 1st Corps, wrote to his wife about Brandy Station. As you will perceive from General Lee's dispatch, the enemy were driven across the river again. All this is not true, but it will be better to allow the impression to prevail. The enemy were not, however, driven back, but retired at their leisure, having accomplished, I suppose, what they intended. The cockiness demonstrated by Stuart and the confidence displayed by Lee permeated the Army of Northern Virginia. These attitudes, combined with the sudden coming of age of the Union cavalry at Brandy Station, foreshadowed things to come in less than a month at Gettysburg. Lee's infantry slips away. On June 10th, United States Secretary of War Edwin Stanton created 2 new departments: the Department of the Susquehanna and the Department of the Monongahela in Pennsylvania. Both were tasked with organizing emergency volunteer units to defend the state during the invasion. In command of the Army of the Susquehanna, where Gettysburg was located, was former Army of the Potomac 2nd Corps Commander Major General Darius N. Couch, who would initially make his headquarters in Chambersburg, but ultimately in Harrisburg. With Lee's army already on the move north and Hooker's still near Fredericksburg, these 2 new departments will prove to be too little, too late. Lee intended to march his infantry into the Shenandoah Valley in order to conceal its movements. Running on a north-south line, the Shenandoah Valley continues straight up into Pennsylvania, where it is known as the Cumberland Valley. Its passes would be covered by Stuart's cavalry in order to prohibit Hooker's troops from penetrating the valley and thwarting the invasion. Now Hooker knew that Lee was on the move. While he correctly guessed that Lee was invading Maryland again, he did not know for sure whether or not Lee was doing so for conquest, or if he was only going far enough to position the Army of Northern Virginia in such a way as to be able to swoop south down onto Washington. Joe Hooker needed more information, so he cautiously set his troops on the road to follow Lee, being sure to keep his army between Lee and Washington. The Second Battle of Winchester.
Major General Schenck. No attempt should be made to hold Winchester against a large force of the enemy. Major General Halleck, General-in-Chief.
I deem it impossible that Lee's army, with its immense artillery and baggage trains, could have escaped from the Army of the Potomac and crossed the Blue Ridge. Major General Robert H. Milroy.
Long before European settlement, the Shenandoah Valley and the Winchester, Virginia area were sacred hunting grounds of Aboriginal Americans and changed hands through warfare for generations. By the time of the Revolutionary War, Daniel Morgan's company of militia was raised from the area and sent to the aid of George Washington's army around Boston. When the Civil War came, Winchester had become a key strategic position for the Confederate States Army. The town and surrounding areas had already been the focus of military engagements during Johnston's defense of the valley in 1861 and Jackson's Valley Campaign in 1862. Now in June of 1863, Winchester was in the hands of a Union garrison under the immediate command of Major General Robert H. Milroy, former lawyer turned judge and radical abolitionist. Milroy had, with his 2nd Division of the 8th Corps of the Middle Department, occupied Winchester since December of 1862. His superior, Major General Schenck, had been advised not to attempt to hold the city against a larger Confederate force. Milroy, who likened himself to Roman Emperor Nero, and who had no love or respect for the Southerners or Secesh that he ruled over, arrogantly dismissed such advice. On June 14th, General Ewell and his Confederate 2nd Corps were perched to make Milroy regret such arrogance and initiated their advance against the defenses of Winchester. Jubal Early's division split up, leaving Gordon's brigade occupying the attention of Union outposts from the south, while Early and his 3 remaining brigades marched west to flank the Federal position. Skirmishing on Gordon's front took place all afternoon. At one point, as Gordon's brigade advanced against the 123rd Pennsylvania and 12th West Virginia, Carlin's Union battery opened fire on the Confederates. Milroy was convinced that the Confederate attack had failed and was over. What he did not know was that Early's other brigades had moved to the west of Winchester and had Milroy all but surrounded. Yet another division of Ewell's Corps, that of Robert Rhodes, occupied Milroy's northern escape route several miles away at Martinsburg. At 6 p.m., Early's 20 artillery pieces opened fire on West Fort for nearly 45 minutes. General Hayes's brigade stormed the fortifications and, after a brief hand-to-hand struggle, caused the Federals to abandon their works, retreating to Fort Milroy to their east. To avoid letting Milroy escape, should he decide to order a retreat, Ewell ordered Johnson's division to occupy the Charlestown Road to Milroy's east-northeast. At the same time this was going on, Milroy was holding a council of war with his subordinates, where the decision was made to retreat to Harper's Ferry via the Charlestown Road. After spiking the cannon and destroying their carriages, Milroy's men snuck out under the cover of darkness. Ewell and his Confederates had no clue about this fact until the following morning, when they awoke to find that the Yankees were gone. But upon his retreat, Milroy's vanguard reached Johnson's Confederate skirmishers. Now Milroy had to fight his way out. Several uncoordinated and failed attempts to dislodge Johnson's brigades resulted in scores of Union soldiers surrendering or fleeing in every direction. In fact, only Milroy and his staff, his cavalry attachment, and other random units had been able to escape to Harper's Ferry. Winchester was now safely in Confederate hands. Furthermore, Ewell's Corps, which had outnumbered Milroy 2 divisions to 1, only suffered 269 casualties while inflicting almost 4,000 on their foe. In addition, Ewell was able to capture 28 pieces of artillery and 300 horses, plus large amounts of much-needed food, clothing, medical supplies, and small arms ammunition. Most importantly, the gate to Pennsylvania had been violently kicked open. Milroy was later court-martialed and exonerated. Afterwards, he claimed that his brilliant defense of Winchester delayed the Confederates long enough to allow Hooker's army to gain ground, so that when the armies met, they would meet as they did at Gettysburg. What the Second Battle of Winchester dispelled, however, were doubts about Ewell's competency at the helm of a corps and confirmed the faith that his troops had in him. Of the Union boys lying mortally wounded by Ewell's bullets was a member of the 87th Pennsylvania, Johnston Jack Skelly, a native and citizen of Gettysburg. Upon learning of Jack's presence on the field, Confederate soldier John Wesley Culp went to find him. Jack and Wes had grown up together in Gettysburg. Wesley had taken employment with the local carriage maker C. William Hoffman. In 1856, Hoffman decided to move his business to Shepherdstown, Virginia, and invited several of his employees along. Wes's brother, William, declined, but Wesley accepted the invitation, leaving his childhood home, family, and friends behind in Gettysburg. In Shepherdstown, Wesley and Hoffman's 3 sons joined the Hamtramck Guards, the local militia and drinking club. When Civil War broke out, Wesley bid his fellow Gettysburg transplants a fond adieu as they left to return to Pennsylvania and fight for the Union. Wesley and the rest of the Hamtramck Guards enlisted in the Confederate service on the 20th of April, 1861, at Harper's Ferry. They became Company B of the 2nd Virginia, which was placed in the 1st Brigade under the command of Colonel Thomas Jonathan Jackson. The brigade and the man at its helm, in short time, earned the nickname Stonewall. Lincoln wrote, "To General Hooker, Winchester and Martinsburg were both besieged yesterday. The enemy holds both places. Confederate troops are crossing the Potomac at Williamsport. I would like to hear from you." From Winchester, Ewell sent Robert Rhodes's infantry division north to raid Chambersburg, Pennsylvania. Along with Rhodes's division was the irregular cavalry brigade of Albert Jenkins, a colorful character who often tucked his long beard into his belt when the wind was up. At 2 a.m. on June 15th, Jenkins led his cavalry on the road to Chambersburg.
Addressing Gettysburg is written, narrated, and produced by Matt Callery. Narration directed by Pearl Shannon. Historical figures voiced by Bradley Lee, Keith Harvey, Braden Border, Bob Steenstra, John Heckman, Dave Wilson, and Ray Chancellor. Historical consultation by licensed battlefield guides Bob Steenstra, Tim Smith, and Louis Trott, with additional help from John Hoptack, Matt Atkinson, and Ken Rich. Music by Dusty Lee Elmer, Sarah Larson and Danny Stewart, Cody Tinnan, the California Consolidated Drum Band, and the Federal City Brass Band, 26 North Carolina Band. Assistant Researcher, Robin Weir.